Good morning anatomy class, or afternoon or evening, or whenever you want to watch this video. We're going to go ahead and start digestive system today. You guys have already finished your review for the respiratory test, which I'm sure didn't take you a standard 45-minute class period. And you have also finished your test, which was probably a little different than what you're used to, but I mean, with the internet and your books and notes and things of that nature, had to be a little different, right? So anyways, we're moving on with the digestive system, but before we do, something that's kind of an interesting application for being in a science course is it's kind of worth us at least taking a couple minutes to talk about what's called epidemiology. And epidemiology is a branch of biology, a branch of microbiology, really, that discusses and looks at basically viruses, bacteria, those kinds of things. How does disease spread? When it spreads, how quickly does it spread, how is the virus or bacteria contagious, those kinds of things. And there's lots of really fascinating social things that go on with that. And since you and I are living this right now, we might as well talk about it, right? It'd be kind of fun. So this is a great graph that really, it helped me a lot kind of understand some of the thinking that might have gone into the governor saying we should close all the schools. Because, as you know, I was kind of the mind that the virus is not terribly lethal, and it is spreading more quickly than the flu, arguably. But boy, it's we're at what, 9 whole cases in South Dakota or something like that. It's a pretty minor thing apparently, but everybody's really freaking out. So this graph really helped me understand, and I really appreciated that. So let's take a look at this. Let's throw a pen on here. This dotted line right here is the capacity of your hospital, right? So let's say we're working with, Monument Health, what used to be regional, and let's say for argument's sake, they're operating at somewhere around 250 beds at Monument Health, right? Assume that they have enough nurses on staff and that they're not all home with their school-aged children, and assume that they have enough doctors and enough, saline and medications and those kinds of things. There is a limit to the number of beds that you can put a person in, right? Every hospital is going to have a different limit, but let's just say that Monument's at 250. It doesn't matter. Let's say at 250. So 250 beds are available at Monument Health. Now, in the Rapid City limits, we have about 60,000 people living, right? Now, granted, with a virus like this, not all 60,000 are going to get sick, okay? So far it says like maybe 9, I don't know, or 8 or 12, it doesn't matter. But when you include that fact that basically your healthcare system here in Rapid is not just serving city limits, right? People in Box Elder, they're heading to, the hospital here in Rapid if they get sick. The same goes for New Underwood, Wasta, Phillip, everything out east, south, all the way down into Hot Springs and the hills. I mean, we could easily be servicing 65 to 70,000 people, maybe more, I don't know, out of this 250 bed hospital. So the idea with these things you're seeing on the news, like we're closing down schools, and some states are putting weird laws on like their restaurants and how many people can sit at a table and how far tables have to be apart. And we're taking all of these basically precautions against density for people to all be in the same sporting event or something like that. Because not surprising to you, places where organisms are densely packed, we're talking nursing homes, high schools, and feedlots for cattle. Disease spreads quickly because there's so many hosts in a given square footage. No duh, you guys made it through biology. That's not a surprise to you. So let's say this whole virus, by the time it's all done, is going to make, I don't know, let's pick a number, 500 people ill in the Black Hills area, right? But we have 250 hospital beds to deal with. Now, 500 is not really that terribly many, but the issue is that if you have all those 500 people heading to the hospital within the same week or two, let's say this period of time with this red graph is about 2 weeks, okay? And so if that's 2 weeks, there's a really sloppy W, sorry, then we would overshoot our hospital's capacity, and that would put the hospital in a bind because now they're either trying to put up some sort of temporary, poorly heated shelters that are outside of the hospital, or you could potentially go to the hospital and, as strange as that seems, have a wait list. Like, they literally can't see you right now. You have to sit and wait. The worse off than that would be actually turning people away, right? And so the issue here is in the town of 60,000, that doesn't really seem like that many, but we'll overshoot our hospital's capacity. So the idea with slowing the spread, doing things like canceling schools and that kind of stuff, if we can slow the spread, we're still going to get the same 500 people sick, right? But let's slow this spread over something like 5 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that. Then what you do is you still get your same 500 people sick, right? We're not stopping the virus magically or anything like that. But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure at any given time there's no more than about 200 people ill with this virus to make up for the other folks who are in there for, broken arms and influenza and that kind of stuff, whatever, right? And that we're not overshooting our healthcare system's capacity by slowing the spread, which is a really, really cool idea. So it's always kind of fun when weird things like this are going on, especially with viruses, because this is not the only context where you make a decision that's intrinsically selfless, that's going to help the society as a whole. And that's really fascinating because, I'm not a doctor, I can't say this, but let's just be honest. You're 17 years old, you're in great health. What are the odds that coronavirus is really going to kick your butt or be super dangerous? Probably not very much, right? But we are protecting the older and the immunocompromised by slowing the spread of the disease to make sure there's a healthcare capacity there to meet their needs. And so it's interesting because it reminds me a lot of our vaccine discussion in bio, that you make a decision based on keeping the population as a whole healthier, which is kind of cool because it's a good thing to keep in mind while folks are fighting over trying to buy 100 rolls of toilet paper at Walmart. It's not all about you, so it's a good thing to keep in mind. Anyway, there's enough about that. You guys can read graphs. Let's talk what you really came here to hear. Digestion. It's so exciting. I know you can't wait. Hopefully you just had breakfast or something like that so you can think about all this digestate rolling through you, but basically your digestive system is going to do some really common sense stuff. To ingest means to literally take in, so ingestion is obviously eating or drinking. Mechanical digestion is, we're not using chemical enzymes, but it's something mechanical. Your teeth is essentially what we're talking about. Your teeth cutting and grinding food into smaller and smaller pieces and giving that food obviously a much larger surface area, because if we took digestive enzymes and poured them onto, let's say, an entire cheeseburger on your plate, that would be disgusting, but it probably wouldn't digest the cheeseburger that well because it's only touching the outside of the cheeseburger. When you put the cheeseburger in your mouth and chew, 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 you've now created this gigantic surface area available on that mashed up food. Not very appealing to the eyes, I'm sure, but gets the job done for digestion. Then there's chemical digestion. Now, chemical digestion, we're talking about essentially enzymes. Again, I'm worried about writing on my keypad, trackpad, whatever you call it. But enzymes are chemicals that are going to break proteins into smaller protein chunks and break those protein chunks into amino acids. And then the amino acids are pulled into your bloodstream and transported all throughout your body so you can build whatever proteins you want to out of the proteins that used to be actin and myosin in the cow muscle that became your cheeseburger. Okay, you make the cow proteins into their individual building blocks and then make them into your proteins. Propulsion. If you're propelled by something like a propeller on a boat or a plane, it's to move forward. Propulsion in this example is the exact same thing. We're going to move food forward through smooth muscle contractions that thankfully you don't have to actually think about for them to work all on their own. Then there's absorption. Absorption is to absorb the nutrition, right? We just talked about the amino acids. Let's just run with that. To absorb those amino acids from the inside of your small intestine into your blood. And once it's in your blood, we can take it everywhere, right? Your muscles and your heart and your brain, and we can get that nutrition where it needs to be. And then finally, defecation. You and I are not 100% efficient. Go figure. I don't know of a critter that is. And so as we go through this whole digestion process, there's going to be something that, a variety of things actually, that you cannot effectively digest and absorb. And so that becomes waste, obviously. You defecate that out as feces, and this whole cycle just kind of repeats itself the next time you have lunch and dinner and on and on and on. So Major organs, quick walkthrough. You guys already know the mouth from last chapter. You know this is your oropharynx, your laryngopharynx, and last chapter we went forward down your trachea into your lungs. This chapter we're going to take tube number 2 and go down what's called your esophagus, okay? So right up here in your mouth are what are called salivary glands. You're going to learn 3 of them, and basically they're going to make your food wet. Now, you can just drink water, or in my case, coffee, when you have your meals, but salivary enzymes also play another huge role. They contain an enzyme called amylase, and amylase is going to break down complex carbs, or at least start that process even before you swallow your bite of a bagel or toast or pasta or whatever carb you like. And remind me when I come back to school, we will actually, I'll bring in some plain old unsalted crackers. And you can do this at home if you really want to. And you just break off a piece of that little cracker, put it in your mouth, and just let it sit. And after about half a minute, when it's covered with your drool, it will become oddly just a little bit sweet. Not sweet like sugar sweet, but sweeter than it was. And that's because when you don't swallow the cracker, that salivary amylase just sits on it and actually breaks down those starches into their simple sugars, which is kind of interesting. So down the food goes past your epiglottis, that little flap of tissue we actually already talked about, and that's going to keep little chunks of hamburger from dropping into your trachea and into your lungs and giving you pneumonia. That would be very annoying. So the epiglottis flops over the top of your trachea, the food rolls down your esophagus, and down the esophagus into this big bag here called your stomach. Your stomach has hydrochloric acid in it to kill the bacteria and the fungi and whatever else is on that sketchy leftover food you probably should have thrown away but decided to microwave and give it a shot anyway. The stomach's going to kill that stuff, and it's also going to start to break apart proteins, but we'll get into all that stuff later. The stomach then dumps into the small intestine. With this diagram, it's a little tricky to see, but the small intestine is the business end of this deal. And basically, the gallbladder leads into it, the pancreas leads into it. All these enzymes mix into this first part of the small intestine called the duodenum or the duodenum. I've heard it both ways. Pick your favorite. And all the digestive juices are mixed in with that food. Essentially, it's not food anymore. It's digestate, but whatever. And it's going to start this very, very long journey down your small intestine. I don't know, 16 feet, 18 feet. It's a long trip, right? All coiled up. And the whole time it's doing this obviously to you should look like surface area, surface area, surface area. This long, slow trip, essentially, your enzymes are breaking down this food and it's being absorbed into your blood. And that's the point of the small intestine. Now, most of our absorption is done in the small intestine. It does lead into the large intestine, this big dehydrating victory lap before the toilet, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, which is this little curved part, rectum, anus, toilet, and we're done. So the large intestine is essentially pulling water, because the digestate in the small intestine is very, very, very liquidy. And of course, when you go to the bathroom, you don't necessarily want it to just be liquidy. But whether you want it to or not, your body wants to recover that water because water is a valuable resource. And so we draw that water out of our digestate in our large intestine. So there's all sorts of accessory organs we're going to talk about one at a time, but it's too much for one slide, so we're going to stop right there and look at some other pictures, okay? So I'm not going to ask you lengths of these different tubes on a test. Just get the idea. You were painting with a broad brush, right? 1/2 meter, okay? So 1.5 feet from the tongue through the stomach to your small intestine. Then once you get into the small intestine, you go to the jejunum and the ileum. Now these terms can be a little bit frustrating. You might want to put a little star in your notes by them or highlight them or whatever. But jejunum is basically the beginning of the small intestine. All right. Now the ileum is the end of the large intestine. And I've got a cool memory trick for you because right here there's a valve between the ileum and the cecum called the ileocecal valve. So with just that, it's very easy to know the ileum is the end. The reason it's frustrating is, to my knowledge, and maybe I'm wrong, there is not an actual anatomical border that we can point to and say, this spot, this structure is where the jejunum ends and the ileum begins. That doesn't really exist. It just is a long small intestine tube, and we just called the front the jejunum and the bottom the ileum. It seems strange to me. Maybe you can find an answer to that. I certainly don't know it, but that's your small intestine. 6 meters long. 6 times 3 is what, 18? So we're around that 18-foot mark, which is pretty respectable. Just go about the length of my lab, and you'll have an idea of how long small intestines were. Okay. Now you get into the large intestine, and you have your appendix, which we'll talk about later, but basically this little tiny bag that houses beneficial bacteria, so that in the case of peristaltic rush or diarrhea, you can recolonize your large intestine with the good bacteria that have been stored in your appendix. It is a valuable organ. Then you have your large intestine, which is only 1.5 meters, and then finally rectum anus, and that's the whole tube, mouth to anus. All right, one big tube, all connected. All right. Let's talk about this. This is a really cool diagram of basically layers of, let's just say, small intestine is probably what it looks like in my opinion. But anyway, so here's your small intestine. The first thing to note is what's called mesentery. Your organs are not floating inside of you by magic or buoyancy in water. Your organs, digestive organs especially, are suspended with a pretty tough sheet of fat, and we'll actually pull that out in the pig so you can check it out. But mesentery allows for your blood supply. Here you can see arteries and veins running through that mesentery and then going into your small intestine wall. And of course the food here, this picture is the inside of this tube, so just imagine that's where all your digestate is. The food is going to be absorbed by these cells and put into your bloodstream. And then your blood is going to carry that all throughout your body and through all your cells, which is really cool. So that's mesentery. Arteries and veins, you already know. Now there are a few different muscles, because even though it's not something we like to think about, there's just a little bit of mobility in our intestines. This circular muscle, especially right here, you see the fiber direction is running around the tube, right? When that contracts and gets shorter, that's essentially going to squeeze that portion of the tube into a smaller diameter. And this is important when we look at things like peristalsis. How do we move this food against the force of gravity to continue its route down the tube? Because not the whole digestive system is not just gravity powered, right? You saw your guts, they're all curly in there and head in all sorts of different directions. Longitudinal muscles will have a similar role. As they contract, they can actually make this longer or shorter and move that food along and mix that food as well. So the thing to know here is that you have ridiculous amounts of surface area, okay? Huge amounts of surface area. You might recall from Gen Bio, you have bumps on your bumps on your bumps, right? You have plicae circularis, which is these kind of folded interior to an already very folded small intestine. And then the plicae circularis, if you kind of zoom in on those, you see that there's all of these bumps in one of these lines. It's also very bumpy. And if you see the surface area here, that food can get all the way down into here and can touch anywhere along this surface that I'm drawing on. So our surface area has just been expanded by who knows how many times. And then when we look at a single cell's, well, I guess we won't go to a single cell just yet, but this single little lining of this epithelium is many, many, many cells, and each cell has itty bitty teeny tiny microvilli like this. So now our surface area is many, many, many times what it would have been if it was just the tube. So the surface area is massive. Just get that idea and I'll be happy with that. There's kind of a cool example here of a lymph node and then a lacteal extending up, and we're actually going to take a lot of our lipids and our fats into that lacteal. A lot of the sugars and proteins will go into your bloodstream, but just get the idea that you're taking the individual building blocks of fats, proteins, and glucose from your carbohydrates, and you're drawing those into your bloodstream through the wall of that small intestine, and you pretty much got the idea. But that surface area is very, very cool. All right, Let's talk about moving through this tube. There's only a couple of them, so it's not going to take us too terribly long. Mixing movements. Your stomach can contract to actually mix the contents around and expose everything in your stomach to digestive juices. You've actually heard this when you hear your stomach growl or gurgle. It's contracting and doing some mixing movements, but there's no food in it and air bubbles are escaping, and that's what you hear when you hear that stomach gurgling sound. The other is a wave of contraction, which is called peristalsis. That's this guy down here. And basically, you need to move food down the tube, and so what you do is you contract one part of the muscle first, then another part, then another part. So it's it's a lot like watching a crowd at a big sporting event do the wave, right? It's a continuous thing around the stadium, okay? And that's the idea, is that if you contract different parts at different times and have these wave-like contractions, you will slowly push food or digestate or chyme or whatever down the tube that it's traveling. So we're going to start, literally go the journey, right? Mouth to anus. Magic school bus style, okay? Except for it's not as exciting because we don't get puked up at the end, but, or, you know, even go on a tiny magic school bus. So here's your mouth. We're going to spend a lot of time here because this is stuff you already know. You know what a lip is, I'm sure. A vestibule, that little line that you've seen on the bottom of your lips, not something you really need to memorize necessarily. The hard palate we've already talked about with the palatine bone and the palatine process of the maxilla. The soft palate we looked at a little bit last chapter. The tonsils we haven't talked about that much. We're gonna have to have that discussion. But yeah, the tonsils we haven't talked about a whole lot just yet. The tongue is to move food around, also helps you speak, of course. And the lingual frenulum is this little band that's going to keep your tongue in place from falling back too far. So, what's the mouth do? Ingests food. Duh. Chews food. Duh. Prepares food for chemical digestion. Sure. And then 32 teeth, okay? 20 when you're a little kiddo, 32 when you're an adult, 28 if you take away the 4 wisdom teeth, and that's a pretty okay count for that. So here is the cross section of the face that you actually just had last chapter, so we're not really going to spend a whole lot of time on that one. But we should know this diagram at this point. We've spent a lot of time on it. Let's move on. I guess note the esophagus is back here, and that's our focus. Last chapter was all about the larynx and the trachea. Now we're worried about the esophagus. This diagram is baby teeth and adult teeth. Sorry for the break. Had to get a drink of coffee. It's like 5 in the morning. So here's the baby teeth, or deciduous teeth if you want to be, you know, all nerdy about it and sounding like you're talking about trees. In come the adult teeth. In come the adult teeth here. And as they come in, they push at the roots of those baby teeth. The baby teeth get wiggly. Out they fall. And in come the adult teeth. So kind of a cool image of how that works. Here's the breakdown by number. I don't care that you necessarily commit this to memory, but if you want to, you certainly can. I would like you to know that you have 32 teeth. You probably know these from elementary school, what they do, and you know, what they kind of chew up and that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to waste your time on that, but those are your teeth. All right. We're not going to do the cross section of the tooth because I don't know how the volume would come across with my headphones on and recording, so I don't want to do that. All right, let's look at salivary glands. There are 3 sets of these, and these are the ones you should know. The first one's your parotid salivary gland. Very useful if you want to try to win that stupid saltine cracker challenge, because you can just massage just anteriorly to your earlobe and you will start to drool like crazy. And here you can see they are an exocrine gland, not an endocrine gland, which means they secrete their products through a duct. So saliva is created in the parotid gland, it's secreted out of this duct and shoots into your mouth, where it's going to interact with all of this food. Here's a really awesome name, sublingual. You might know somebody who's bilingual, right? They speak 2 languages. They're bilingual, or the speaker of 2 tongues. So sublingual, sub means beneath. So the sublingual gland literally means beneath the tongue, which is like, what a great name, right? So the sublingual gland is the salivary gland beneath your tongue. And then another great name, submandibular, beneath the mandible. In the skeletal chapter, you'll recall that this guy right here is the mandible, the jawbone, right? We don't call that jawbone, that's ridiculous. The mandible, and that beneath the mandible, submandibular, is this gland right here. And again, those are all leading up into the mouth. So please know those three. Make a Quizlet or write those down, put a little star by them. Very cool salivary glands that are going to help you digest your complex carbs in your mouth. Another picture of the pharynx, we've already talked about that. I'm not too worried about that. This is a super hard picture, I think, to sort of figure out what's going on. But here's your mandible. Here's a whole set of muscles that are lifting and constricting and changing that shape, essentially, of when you're going to swallow, that larynx kind of coming up. And then here's your epiglottis. And it's important to note that the term for the opening to the trachea, this guy right here, is the glottis. We'll write it out, even with my slow trackpad. My screen really looks like it's glitching out. I wonder if it looks that way to you guys. I imagine it would. The glottis is the opening to your trachea. And so this guy right here that protects it, or is above it, is the epiglottis. And so when you swallow, all of these muscles kind of work this larynx upward. They squeeze this down a little bit, and then the food rolls over the epiglottis and down into your esophagus, and you don't choke on your food or water. All right. So there's swallowing mechanism. The soft palate and uvula both raise. The hyoid bone and larynx elevate, which you can actually feel with your fingers. If you just put your fingers on your voice box and swallow, you'll feel that rise. The epiglottis closes off the top of the trachea, which is really, really the important part. And then the longitudinal muscles of your pharynx contract, which means we're pushing our food backward with the muscles of our mouth and throat. And then our esophagus opens up, and we're able to send that food down the esophagus and to keep all of it out of the trachea, because it is quite the dangerous intersection there. Peristaltic wave, or that contraction of muscles down the tube, pushes food through your pharynx and into your esophagus, and your esophagus carries that food down to your stomach. So here's your first diagram. The tongue is pushing that food back into the pharynx. Here you can see your epiglottis and the trachea and the glottis. Here's your esophagus. Okay, step 2, our soft palate is actually lifted just a little bit, which is kind of cool. The tongue is pressed against the palate, so your tongue is doing a lot of the swallowing here. Your epiglottis, do you see how it's folding over like this right here? Epiglottis folds over that trachea, and now the food only has one place to go, which is down this tube right here. So we have all sorts of muscles up here, these superior constrictors. I don't care if you memorize their names, but basically they're going to contract and push that food down the esophagus. And then peristalsis is going to take that bolus of food all the way down to the stomach. So that even if you're, I don't know, laying on your side, I don't know how well that would work, but it, as far as getting down the esophagus, it totally would. You could still, push that food down to your stomach if gravity were not helping you. So here's your esophagus. I'll give you a couple of neat things about the esophagus, and then we're going to call it a lecture because I feel like I'm around that 20-25 minute mark, and I don't want to run you over half an hour. So here is your heart. Your heart is not shaped like that, and you guys already know that, but we're going to draw it in anyway. Your esophagus is a hollow muscular tube that ends in your stomach. Now, right here is a muscle called your lower esophageal sphincter. A sphincter is just a ring of muscle that can contract to stop the flow of something. There's quite a few sphincters you're going to learn about in this chapter, but the LES, the lower esophageal sphincter, made famous by the, what's his name? Fastest hot dog shooter in the Midwest, Northwest, something like that. We talked about the lower esophageal sphincter already. But the lower esophageal sphincter is essentially going to close off. Once the food makes it from your esophagus into your stomach, the LES will open up to allow the food through, and the LES will close so that the food can be mixed in your stomach but not exit your stomach. Now, in some people, it's important to understand that the stomach is lined with mucus that protects it from the dangerous hydrochloric acid. The esophagus is not lined with mucus that protects it from hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And so for some folks, when they get enough indigestion, or whatever you'd like to call it, acid reflux it's often called, that the stomach is churning and moving, and acid is actually being pushed up past that lower esophageal sphincter, that acid will actually burn this mucosal layer right here and will hurt those muscles. And as it does that, that person is going to experience what most people call heartburn. Heartburn is not burning your heart. It's lower esophageal burn. But nobody wants to say lower esophageal burn. And since the lower part of your esophagus is right where your heart is, we call it heartburn. And that's how you get heartburn. But that's an esophagus, and now we've made it to the stomach. So we're going to stop there. I have a stomach labeling diagram. We'll see what that looks like for getting some options online for you guys for next time, but it's pretty straightforward. So I hope you learned something new. Hang in there, and I'll see you guys next week, I imagine. Thanks.